Welcome to this seventh episode of the Binary Agora. In this series, we dive deep into the world of legal tech, breaking down its challenges, its innovations, and real-world impacts with insights from top researchers. Today, we'll discuss about AI in a slightly different manner within the area of public procurement, specifically with Professor Albert Sánchez-Graells, and he has authored two leading monographs, both on public procurement and the last one also published with Oxford University Press relating to its intersection with digital technologies. He's also a professor of economic law at the University of Bristol, and he's also an avid writer through his How to Crack a Nut blog. So welcome, Albert, to the channel.
Thank you, Alba. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, and getting straight into it, we're normally thinking about AI with regards to the private nature of the companies developing these technologies. So I wanted to maybe start the conversation by asking you, how do you think that the public sector is really faring in terms of being a trailblazer in terms of AI adoption, or whether the public sector is really behind within the adoption of these technologies?
So that's a very good question. And I think we have a bit of a disconnect between what people imagine or the expectation and the hype and what's actually happening on the ground. So the expectation in an ideal world, you would have the public sector being, as you say, a trailblazer, being some institution that is both funding innovation and trying to co-create innovation with private industry. And it would also be strategically deciding where the AI should be adopted and what is safe AI and so on. But the reality is quite different. What you see, and of course it depends a bit by jurisdiction, but the common themes are the public sector right now experiences lots of FOMO. It's, oh no, the private sector is using AI for everything. We should too. What we see is the public sector has a very long-running problem with the information systems that it uses. It has lots of legacy systems that are difficult to maintain, and adding AI on them is both difficult and also not going to fix them. And the other issue with the public sector is that it has a very significant skills gap. So right now, because there's such a boom in AI, if you know anything about it or can pretend to know, you can get a very lucrative job in the private industry. So it's very hard to actually find people that want to work as data scientists or computer engineers in the public sector. So right now there is all of this sort of willingness to go quickly, but the infrastructure for that is not clear. The information is not there, the skills are not there. And also simple things like strategies on how do we deal with all this AI being inserted into systems that we have, how to try to get the public servants to do something meaningful on, do we use AI, do we not? All of those things are still very much to be done. So we have plenty to try to sink our teeth into in the next few minutes.
The adoption of these technologies from an institutional perspective and also from an individual perspective. So civil servants integrating within their work phones, TikTok, I'm thinking, or DeepSeek, and those have been like major challenges for the public sector as well. So I wanted to ask you, what risks can we associate both from the institutional but also from the individual perspective regarding to the adoption of off-the-shelf generative AI services, and whether those services are specific for the public sector or whether they are distinguishable from those of the private sector?
Probably on that, it's not too different to have a public sector organization or a private organization. If I was an insurance company or a bank, I would also be very worried about whether my employees are using off-the-shelf solutions without necessarily my consent. But in the public sector, I think the starting point probably should be to take maximum responsibility. And for example, with the Irish authorities or what the Dutch authorities have said, is that the starting position is that it's prohibited to use off-the-shelf generative AI, and that if an institution wants to use generative AI for a specific use case, they need to go to a detailed impact assessment, and they also need to consider whether off-the-shelf is actually the solution. Most of the time it's not going to be, because you have heightened data protection requirements, because you have issues with confidentiality and exchange of information. So probably what you will need to be looking at is at the very least fine-tuned for the specific use case. That's not happening everywhere. So in the UK, the position is the reverse, and the starting point is go and experiment. And it's interesting to look into those experiments. So for example, the Digital Service of the UK has just published a report. They did a pilot of Copilot in the last quarter of 2024 across almost all central governments, and they had 20,000 public servants reporting on the use. And what they found is, on average, a Copilot could save about 26 minutes a day, but there's a big variation. And the difficulty is what to make with that sort of result. yes, it could save 26 minutes, but nobody's assessing whether the work you do with the generative AI is actually of the same quality or can create problems down the line. And one of the things that I think is interesting is that people that know what they're talking about say you shouldn't use generative AI if you cannot really check the output. And what I think is happening in many of these cases that we are just creating output, but we are not checking it. And that's what I would be worried if I was a public sector leader, is that there's such pressure in trying to use generative AI to allow civil servants to do more because they're all under strain. But doing more that is not going to be good is actually going to be worse in the longer term. You have lots of failed decisions here and there. So I think we are not very clear on what good looks like in terms of using generative AI. It's also sometimes maybe the wrong solution for the wrong problem. So for example, it can save lots of time in minute taking for meetings. But maybe the question is, should all meetings necessarily be minuted? Or even the better question, should things be a meeting that could maybe be an email exchange, right? There's a proliferation of meetings and that happens in all organizations. So sometimes there's also with the feeling that the AI can be sort of a patch to cover an issue that actually is much more fundamental and probably needs addressing in a different way. And the final thing to say about generative AI is also it cannot be used for things that are factual. And I'm sure this is something you've been following, but even on the best benchmarks, they tend to be factually correct about the newer models are confabulating more than the older ones. So in any setting where accuracy is important and public sector usually deals with things that require accuracy, then generative AI is not going to be a very good solution because it creates tons of error that then will need to be filtered through.
Building on the fact that you were saying about skills and how to train the civil servants and the institutions, really, I was thinking that maybe the public sector also has to understand, as also private companies have to do, that we are facing with generative AI services not deterministic systems that are basically how we used a calculator or a navigation service, but rather probabilistic systems, so that these systems are really aimed at spotting out patterns within data, and they are going to spew the most probable or the best answer that they believe that fits within the context, not really, as you were saying, the most factually accurate answer. Maybe you could say two words or flesh out a bit how you believe that AI literacy is going to be implemented within the public sector.
I think it's very challenging because the public sector is enormous and it also has lots of different layers. And I've been giving some training, for example, on AI procurement. And what you find is that most of the time, the civil servants come wanting to be told what specific tools do I use and how do I use them. What they don't tend to like, although they recognize the value in it, is in actually raising the literacy and say, wait a minute, before you want to use a specific generative AI tool, for example, you need to understand those issues. And probably that is going to mean that it might not be the right tool for your specific use, or you will need to change it a little bit. It's also very hard to make people understand that these are going to be processes of change that are not only about your tool, but it's going to change your workflow, it's going to change your institutional governance. And it's not as simple as saying, well, I used to have somebody taking minutes and I'm just going to have an AI assistant. So therefore, this person can do something else or I can get rid of them. It's not that sort of change. The other thing is probably quite difficult to explain, which is people are quite blinded in how these things do it very quickly. But the other aspect of literacy that is important to understand is what are the impacts of that. So we know that developing these models is massively energetically intensive. It also uses tons of computing and therefore rare earths and minerals. Loads of the tagging of data that goes into training these is quite exploitative in other jurisdictions. Somebody gave an example that I think is quite telling, which says, using an LLM to write you an email is like lighting up a football stadium to go to the toilet at night, right? It's not it's not proportionate. And those are the things on literacy that I think are difficult to convey, and also they're invisible. So it's very hard for people to apprehend them unless you come with these sort of silly examples. And that's why maybe the first step is to try to identify AI is going to be a good tool for a very narrow set of things. And you need to be very careful in only deploying it then, and also in a specific way. But use case horizon scanning, if you want, is something that we need to do more about. The other thing that of course is going to be a problem is we're going to have more and more attention between entities in the public sector that can afford to gain those skills and upskill and retain people. So for example, from what I hear, the Madrid City Council is quite advanced and has a big data science team. But I can imagine that the city council in a much smaller population is not going to have that. So it also goes to issues of equity and equality. And are we going to have a public sector that looks roughly the same everywhere, or are we going to have sort of winners and losers or postcode lottery? And that's also things that are going to be important.
Going back to governance, because I focus my research now on DMA, especially also DSA and AI Act. So we are always thinking about concentration levels and how big tech companies do have like this strong hold over the market, about how their services interact with users, how they can deceive users. So I was wondering, how do you believe, and I believe that you call it a two-way gatekeeper position. I would be interested in you fleshing it out a bit, because I believe it's really interesting to think about these instances of AI public procurement that really intersects with another like great force, which is big tech developers and even also deployers of AI, such as, for instance, OpenAI or Anthropic.
It's interesting because it's a traditional issue of lock-in, and in the public sector, usually procurement has been quite poor at dealing with technological lock-in. So we don't see the same names because it's not about Anthropic or OpenAI. What we see is mainly Microsoft and Google, and it has to do with the cloud that is used. So whether you use Azure or Google, but also your back office. What's happened in the public sector is that loads of the public sector used to have Microsoft servers, so then they moved to Azure. So now they define themselves as a Microsoft house, which means naturally Microsoft is in a better position to just simply say you can have Copilot for free or discount it, or bundle it or tie it. We could analyze it in competition terms, but from the public service perspective, the difficulty we have is that because you have to integrate whatever AI solution into your old stack. If your old stack is single technology, so if you're Microsoft, it's very unlikely you're going to go for something that is not Microsoft compatible or easy to make compatible. And we see that affects things in very strange ways. So it will mean that they can have a very strong position in some sectors, but very weak in others. Others may be much more geared towards back office solutions like Oracle or other things. So it's hard to see. But I was surprised, for example, when the Competition Markets Authority in the UK, in their cloud assessments, basically said, we don't think there is a big issue in procurement. And I think it's the opposite. What's going to happen more and more is that the procurement rules will not be applicable because they will try to give direct awards on the basis of interoperability, or they will try to give direct awards on the basis of exclusive technical capability, or procurement will be altogether sidestepped because maybe the central government is going to have a single deal with the big provider, and that's going to then be offered to the rest of the public sector. So most organizations will not even carry on their own procurement. They will just draw from these generic framework agreements or dynamic purchasing systems. And the other thing that is quite difficult in that context is to think about at what point will the public sector decide this is not acceptable, for example, from the perspective of sovereignty or from the perspective of weakness. Because going back to the issue of the two-sided gatekeeper, the idea is that traditionally procurement only had to control what the provider does. So you should be in a position where you can dictate the terms of your public contract. And that's a theory. In software, it's not been the case. In cloud, it's not been the case. The public buyer is a conditions taker. And with AI, it's even worse because it's not only that, say, the procurement department or the central purchasing body will take whatever conditions the provider wants to give, but also they are not in a position to then control how that AI is used, which creates the other problem. Can create basic problems like budget. Lots of these things are bought on financial models that depend on use. And if you're not going to be able to control the use, you don't know whether your contract is going to be right or wrong or what's going to happen. But the other thing is you don't know what it's going to be deployed for. So the other issue is if you don't have a developer that is particularly ethically orientated or particularly careful about complying with public sector obligations, be it under the EU AI Act or more generally, and you don't have a public administration that is particularly concerned either, then we will end up writing contracts that are just a fiction, right? They will say, oh, this contract is aligned with the EU AI Act, but then both the provider and the final user ignore it, and procurement is sidestepped, so to speak. So it creates a difficulty in the regulatory entry point, because it used to be that procurement is the funnel, so therefore controlling procurement controls what the public sector does. Now procurement is like a revolving door, so things can just go through without meaningful control.
On the note of that regulatory entry point, I always considered that maybe the EU AI Act applied, So to all of these technologies, and that's precisely what the European Commission has been doing, like with the model contractual AI clauses. So maybe you could provide us with a bit of perspective on why the AI Act is not really applicable in most cases, or how then can we really like satisfy that gap within the regulation.
There's 2 points of weakness in the EU Act approach. The first is that, as you also have discussed, we have a series of high-risk use cases, and most of those high-risk use cases, they relate to public sector activity, so benefits and migration, education, and law enforcement. But then we have Article 6.3, which allows us to exempt on a basis, for example, whether something is a narrow procedural task or whether something is preparatory for another decision. And I think that's going to be the bulk of things happening in the public sector, because we will not see full automation. We'll just see a slicing of procedures. So we have a first issue. Are we even going to be within the scope of application of the obligations under the EU Act? But even when we are, so let's say, public sector for education is going to use an AI to allocate university spots, clearly high risk use. Let's look at what the EU Act says. And what the EU Act says is quite general. For example, it says, the developer has to commit to an appropriate level of accuracy, for example, going back to our example of accuracy. And then there are these model clauses that also say it has to be an adequate level of accuracy, because we still don't know what it means. They have an Annex G that says this is what accuracy is about, but Annex G says, please describe here what's accuracy, how you're going to measure it. So we have gone full circle. The public sector needs to buy technology where accuracy is important. We need to regulate that accuracy, but in the end, we still leave it to either proposals in a public tender or basically unilateral determination by the provider. So we have a regulatory structure that is an empty shell, and we will still require for the public sector to know enough to be able to impose obligations, to be able to monitor obligations, and to be able to understand, for example, what 90% accuracy means when you're allocating university spaces, or what 90% accuracy means when you are buying ID solutions that can lock people out of digital services. So that's why I don't think the EU Act takes us very far, because it's going to be a matter of negotiation. And what we said before, public sector is weak compared to these big tech companies. Public sector doesn't have lots of skills. So we basically still have the work to do. And then the question I usually get when I give that slightly depressive answer is to say, okay, then what's the solution? And I think the solution is that we should really have defaults. So we should say, okay, all else being equal, for example, you should aim for an accuracy of, say, 95%. This is how you measure it. This is how you test it. Now, if you want to deviate from that very stringent standard, then you need to figure out how to do it. But at least have some safeguards that are actually click and deploy in your contract, rather than having each contracting authority figure it out.
This reminds me of all of the digital regulations that the EU, and maybe in the UK it's quite similar, introducing concepts that mean different things in different contexts, so that when they are generated anew, then we must redefine them and really set apart whether we are talking about the same thing or about completely different things. For instance, the notion of contestability within EU competition law and the DMA comes to mind. And also on the AI Act note, I was thinking that not to be too pessimistic in the sense of criticizing the AI Act, but it's true that AI models and how these deployers have been measuring their accuracy and their good performance in general has been quite skewed, in the sense that even some of these deployers have cheated within some tests. So it's quite difficult to try to narrow down accuracy to one single metric. So maybe more stakeholder participation would contribute to the discussion further. And to finish off the discussion, you're also really focused on this interplay between public procurement, EU competition law, now on digital technologies. And I also read on your SSRN that you're also focusing on the shaping of digital technologies and how those can take place within the wider phenomenon of public procurement. Aside from all of the risks that we have already outlined, what do you think that public procurement and that regime that, for instance, as EU competition law lawyers, we do not maybe know so much about, how can it contribute to shaping these digital technologies and making them, for instance, more trustworthy or accountable towards the public?
There's 2 points of intervention. The first one is that, linking to the issue of participation that you were raising, procurement could be made more open. to society. For example, if the City Council of Bristol has a budget for digital technologies, maybe they could consult on whether do we want them to be deployed for something that has to do with education or healthcare, or something that has to do with traffic management or bin collection, but just give the local community a little bit of a say in what areas are a priority, but also what areas are seen as safer for experimentation. And I think procurement could do that, because procurement is more and more moving towards market engagement, and market engagement is only about talking to industry. But I think when it comes to AI, you should engage the broader community, not only the market participants. But the other one is about, quite frankly, being very strict. So I think that the difficulty is that we are now in a setting where, especially after the Trump election and the revision of Omnibus and all of these things, we were moving towards regulating, and all of a sudden we got shy. And it's not very clear how far we want to go or not. I think from the public sector perspective, we should take a traditional administrative law position, which is to say we have very heightened duties towards our citizens. So the technology that we buy and the use cases have to be absolutely fail-safe. So, if you are trying to develop an app and it recommends, I don't know, good restaurants 80% of the time, that might be good enough. But if you're developing an app for the public sector, it needs to work out basically 99% of the time. And so by setting really, really stringent standards, you would come to develop an industry that is actually able to deliver to those standards. And that could have positive effects in the private industry. The problem right now is that we're doing it the opposite way and just saying, oh, in private industry, 80% is good enough. So surely it should be for us too. And the final thing is also to distinguish between procurement and grant. So the other thing we haven't spoken about at all is state aid. But if we want to develop an EU homegrown AI industry because of strategic reasons, or what we need to do is put money into it, not through public contracts and using sort of public services as a guinea pig, but just give proper grants and decide what it looks like, and then buy things that have been developed, rather than using procurement as the development and testing side. Because quite frankly, we shouldn't be playing with our public services in this way. And also we should understand that every €5 that you spend from a budget for AI are €5 you're not spending on the front line. The money is not multiplying. So we also need to be quite careful and considerate in what pilots we choose and how much money we move from one thing to AI and so on.
So on that note, on regulatory shyness, I have noted it down. I maybe use it in some paper or blog because I really like that concept, especially with all of the regulatory simplification also coming within the EU, and especially with regards to the GDPR. So I wanted to thank you, Albert, for the really exciting discussion, and also the provocative thoughts, especially because we are not so used to hearing people talk about the public sector and how also market dynamics may impact this particular area of research. So that's a wrap for this episode. Thank you so much for coming, Albert. And if also you have any thoughts or any feedback for both me or Albert, just drop a comment below.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.